Well, good morning. It's good to be with you guys this morning. It's good to have the opportunity to spend this time together and enjoy something different over this Independence Day weekend. And this morning I want to just talk for a few minutes, and I want to teach on something that I believe is really important for us to understand and to be aware of as we think about the state of our nation during this time of the year. And that thing is something that we call our national conscience. Now, if you've ever attended Wednesday night Bible study, you might have heard me talk about our national conscience, because there are often so many parallels between our country right now and Israel in the Old Testament. But I think for the most part, the idea of a national conscience is pretty unfamiliar to a lot of Christians. So let me kind of explain what it is that I'm talking about. Typically, when we talk about our conscience, we think of our personal conscience, which is that thing inside of us that informs our sense of right and wrong. There are just some things that you know are right to do, and there are some things that you know are wrong to do. And I would ask you, how do you know which is which? And you're really not sure. They just seem to be sort of built into your heart and your mind. That is your personal conscience. We all have one of those. We do all have one of those, yes? Okay, all right. I just want to make sure. Now, the interesting thing about a conscience is this. Have you ever thought about it? You can ignore it. Yes or no? Yes. Yeah, you can ignore your conscience. How many of us have ever ignored our conscience? And we knew we should do that thing, but we didn't do it. Or we knew we should be far away from here, but we went ahead and went where we shouldn't be. What you may not realize, though, is that it's possible not only to ignore your conscience, you can actually ignore your conscience long enough that you get to the point where after a while, you just don't even feel it anymore. In fact, for some of us, part of our story, the story of our faith journey, was that at some point, our conscience became so calloused that God would try to speak into our heart, and we would just ignore it and ignore it and ignore it until after a while, we didn't even feel the pain and the consequence of sin anymore. Well, that's the nature of a conscience. Now, what we don't think about is this. Every individual has a personal conscience, but there's also such thing as a collective conscience. A collective conscience is basically values and expectations that are shared by a group of people. And you guys all have this in your family. There are just sort of some unspoken rules that your family agrees upon. And these rules, or maybe their values or expectations, are often going to be very specific to your family. No two families' collective conscience is going to be exactly the same. As an example, one of the unspoken rules or expectations at my house is that we're going to be kind of loud and dramatic. Okay? You come to the Ford house, that's just how it is. And when you introduce new people into our family, like my son-in-law Dustin, or Josh's girlfriend Riley, they sometimes look at us like, are these people okay? And we just say, yeah, no, we're fine. We're fine. We're just kind of loud and we're just kind of dramatic. And the reality is that Josh kind of takes care of the loud, and normally Mackenzie's dramatic. So the funny thing is, your family has unwritten rules and unwritten expectations too. Why? Because each family has this unique collective conscience. Families have that. Companies have that. Friendship groups have that. And here's the deal. Nations have a collective conscience as well. Let me give you an example of a conscience issue for the United States. How many of you, even if you knew you could get away with it, would never take just a big bag of fast food garbage that your whole family had collected and just chunk it out the window as you were driving down the highway? How many of you would never do that? Raise your hand. Okay, that's just about everybody, and I'm taking notes of who said they wouldn't do that. But here's my question. Why? Why is that something that you would never do? Well, here's why. Because it's just wrong, isn't it? That's just wrong. But why is it wrong? Well, it's against the law. Okay, but but even if it wasn't against the law, you still wouldn't do it, would you? But you see, you go to other countries, they don't automatically feel that way. They don't think twice about that. We took our kids to Belize 5 or 6 years ago. And I remember them commenting as we were driving through Belize City, this huge city, millions and millions of people. And they were like, Dad, look at all the trash on the side of the road. If you've traveled in other countries, you probably know what I'm talking about. In some countries, trash piling up beside the road is just such a normal way of life, they don't even see it. They don't even have a concept of trash. But in the United States, our collective conscience says that we should not litter. Law or no law, we ought not do that, right? Now that's sort of the gentle example of collective conscience for a nation. Here are some heavier examples of national conscience issues. The anti-slavery movement that resulted in the Civil War was fueled by national conscience. The Civil Rights Movement and the laws that consequently were changed came as a result of a national conscience. Abortion is an issue that's fueled by conscience on both sides of the issue. In the U.S., as a nation, abortion is currently legal in some states, and it's illegal in other states. But here's the deal. Culturally, we've gotten to the point where collectively we've said, okay, if a woman wants to terminate her pregnancy, I guess that's really up to her and her doctor and her God and however she views the world. Now, again, not everybody agrees with that. Many people think that is absolutely wrong. But as a culture, collectively, and I don't really care what the law currently says, because guess what? Laws change, don't they? But currently, this is where we are. Even though there was a time, and many of us can't even remember it, but there was a time when having an abortion was not acceptable to the people of the United States, whether it was legal or not. Now it is. It's part of a national conscience, the values and expectations shared by the people of a nation. Now, two other things about collective or national conscience. With a strong collective conscience, you don't typically need many rules and regulations. And the best example of that is a great marriage. In a great marriage, you typically don't see a lot of stated rules and regulations. Stated rules and regulations show up when a marriage is going poorly, right? That's when we have to start putting things around it to make sure we don't get outside of it. If you've ever started a company, or you were with a company when it was very, very small, you know what I'm talking about not needing a lot of rules and regulations. When a company is just you and your partner and a couple of other people, you do not have to have an employee handbook, do you? It's just not necessary. Because do we really have to write down, do not take pens from the office and put them in your children's backpack for school? Do we really have to write that down? And those of you involved in large companies are going, yes, we absolutely have to write that down. But those of you who work with a small company would say, no, we don't have to write that down. That's clearly stealing. And it should go without saying. Because with a strong collective conscience, you just typically don't need many rules and regulations. Now, the other thing about conscience that you need to know, a conscience must be informed. And this is really important. A conscience must be informed. See, the reason you don't feel good about throwing your trash out the window is because somebody taught you to feel that way. You sort of think that's intrinsic. You think that's natural. That's not natural. That is not something that you're born with. So even though there's this inherent sense of some things are right, some things are wrong, conscience still has to be informed. It's true for individuals. It's true for families. And hear me, it's especially true for nations. Now, all of that leads us to ask this question about our nation on this Independence Day weekend. Here's the question. What has informed our national conscience in the past? Now, I want you to think about that question for a second. Don't just skip past it. I want you to think about it, and I want you to internally try to answer that question. What has informed our national conscience as a people in the past? What has told us what is right and what is wrong?
Bible.
There's no doubt we have a national conscience. There are things that just do not feel right to us or don't feel wrong to us as Americans. Would you guys agree with that? And it's different than other cultures. We're not the same as everybody else. It has changed over the years and through different generations. We don't feel the same way today that maybe it was felt in 3 or 4 generations past. But what originally informed that national conscience, I'm talking about going all the way back to the beginning. And the answer to that question, I believe, is a sense of personal and national accountability to the Creator God. A sense of personal and national accountability to the Creator God. That is what shaped our national conscience. In other words, our national conscience was originally shaped and informed by a general sense that there is a God who is Creator, and somehow we personally and we nationally should be grateful for and are accountable to this God. That is how our national conscience was originally informed. Now, I know this is uncomfortable for some people. And I'm actually not arguing that the Founding Fathers were all Christians. I'm not arguing that all the Founding Fathers saw the world the same way in terms of theology. I'm not arguing that they all saw the Bible in the same way. Because guess what? They didn't. But I am arguing that there was a sense of personal and national accountability to God that has in a huge way shaped and informed our national understanding of what is right and of what is wrong. And I would just ask you, you don't have to respond out loud, but I would ask you, do you agree with that? It sounds slightly dangerous for me to say it, but if you think about it, it's the simplest thing in the world. It's the most obvious thing in the world. So why do we feel so weird about acknowledging that? Now let me give you a couple of examples of what I'm talking about here. Here's something you memorized in school. This is the second sentence from the Declaration of Independence. And I want you to listen to this through the filter of what we were just talking about, what I've just said. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, this is huge. Here's how our Founding Fathers viewed the world. We're going to start a nation by breaking away from England, yes? And why do you feel that we ought to do that? Because of the way God has clearly designed mankind. And under the current structure, we're not able to act in a way that reflects the way God made us. And so therefore, it is right for us to start a war and found a new nation. Now, obviously, that's not the only reason behind the American Revolution, but the second sentence of the Declaration of Independence assumes a Creator and assumes the presence of God as a basis for what is right and for what is wrong. This is what we ought to do based on how God made all men. And then there's this incredible speech that many of us memorized in school, the Gettysburg Address. Anybody remember that and having to memorize all of that 7 years ago, right? President Abraham Lincoln introduced 2 words in that speech that remind us of what originally informed our national conscience. Speaking after this terrible, bloody Civil War battle, here's what he says: that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, but that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom. This nation, under God. Now, what does that mean? Well, again, it's not complicated. It's very simple. It means that Abraham Lincoln viewed our nation as under the authority of and the accountability to the Creator God. And in that culture, he was not afraid to leverage that language and that worldview as he talked about political issues. He said, we are a nation under God. We don't get it right every time. We are having a civil war because we are an imperfect nation. But at the end of the day, nobody's arguing about whether or not we are accountable to God. We know we are accountable to the Creator. Then, in the 1950s, that little phrase was lifted out of the Gettysburg Address and was placed in the Pledge of Allegiance. And so now, after 1950, we are one nation, you remember, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. So whenever you say the Pledge of Allegiance, think about this. You are actually declaring that as a nation, we view God as our authority. Now, do we all agree about God throughout the entire nation? Yes or no? No. Do we all believe the same thing about the Bible? No. It's much broader than that. But there has always been the acknowledgement of the accountability to God. And then, in 1956, something happened that most of us don't even know about. Did you know that 60 years ago, the 84th Congress declared that we would have a brand new national motto? A national motto. Anybody know what it is? I'm getting it. Okay, well, you figured it out, right? Because you're looking... No, you knew it. Okay, good. Here's what President Eisenhower signed into law July 30th, 1956. Our national motto, say it with me. In God we trust. In God we trust. Our national motto. Now that phrase had been on our coinage since after the Civil War, but as recently as 1956, Congress decided to make "In God We Trust" our national motto. Now, here's my question for you. What in the world were they thinking? I'll tell you what they were thinking. They were thinking, "In God we trust." But almost nobody knows this. Now here's the deal. If you work at Home Depot, tomorrow you can walk into your store and you can shout out, "You can do it," and everybody in that place is going to respond, "And we can help." Okay, that's the motto for Home Depot. If you go onto the campus of the University of Oklahoma and you shout out, "Boomer," you're going to get a response. Yes. Or, I don't know, what's the other one? Pistols.
Firing.
Yeah. Makes sense, but whatever. If you work for Chick-fil-A, you can walk in, not today, but you can walk in tomorrow, right? And you can say, "Eat more," and everybody's going to say, "Chicken," right? Now, let me ask you this. Those are mottos. Those are sort of the simplified mission statements, okay? Let me ask you this. What if on the first day of school this August, kids are going back to school, what if every principal of every public school in our nation addressed their students, big assembly, and said, "Kids, before we start a brand new school year, I just want to remind you of something. In God we trust. Kids, do not forget, trust God when you're trying to think about what's right or what's wrong." Whoa, you want to talk about lawsuits? People will be pulling their kids out of school. We've established a religion. And we could say, well, wait a minute. It's the national motto. Well, I don't care if it's the national motto or not. You're trying to impose religion on my child. No, I'm just quoting the national motto. As signed into law by the Congress we elected as a nation. And it hasn't changed to this day. But here's why that would be a national scandal. Because we've drifted so far away from God talk in our nation that it's now strange to hear it. And that sadly reminds me of a passage of Scripture that was spoken to Israel, but I believe is still very relevant to the United States. It's found in Deuteronomy chapter 8, as the nation of Israel is about to enter the Promised Land. This is like a big moment, really, certainly in Israel history, but even in human history. After 400 years of slavery, and then 40 more years of wandering in the wilderness. They're about to experience several generations of prosperity, protection, and incredible blessing by God. And if you know your Old Testament, you can probably quickly think of some of the stories of the way God protected and provided for them. But before they're allowed to cross the Jordan River and enter into the Promised Land, God gives them a challenge, almost a warning through Moses. And I want to read it to you, and I want you to listen through the filter of everything that I've said to you so far this morning. Okay? Here we go. This is Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 1. It says this: "Be careful to follow every command I am giving you today, so that you may live and increase and may enter and possess the land the Lord promised on oath to your ancestors." Verse 6. "Observe the commands of the Lord your God, walking in obedience to Him and revering Him. For the Lord your God is bringing you into a good land, a land with brooks, streams, and deep springs gushing out into the valleys and hills, a land with wheat and barley, vines and fig trees, pomegranates, olive oil, and honey. A land where bread will not be scarce and you will lack nothing. A land where the rocks are iron and you can dig copper out of the hills." Verse 10. "When you have eaten and are satisfied, praise the Lord your God for the good land He has given you. Be careful that you do not forget the Lord your God, failing to observe His commands, His laws, and His decrees that I am giving to you this day. Otherwise, when you eat and are satisfied, when you build fine houses and settle down, and when your herds and flocks grow large and your silver and gold increase and all you have is multiplied." And may I just stop and say, He's describing us, is He not?
Yes.
I mean, that is us. That is us individually. That is us as a church. That is us as a community. And really, that's us as a nation. He says, when all of that good stuff has taken place, verse 14, then your heart will become proud, and you will forget the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. Verse 17, you may say to yourself, my power and the strength of my hands have produced this wealth for me. But remember the Lord your God, for it is He who gives you the ability to produce wealth, and so confirms His covenant, which He swore to your ancestors, as it is today. Verse 19. If you ever forget the Lord your God, and follow other gods, and worship and bow down to them, I testify against you today, you will surely be destroyed. Like the nations the Lord destroyed before you, so you will be destroyed for not obeying the Lord your God. Now, that's a heavy verse, but as I read Deuteronomy 8, do you see the warning that applies to us as Americans? Do you see how gratitude for and accountability to God over time has been pushed further and further into the background of our national dialogue? Now, maybe you say, well, so what? I mean, why does this really matter? So my kids don't hear about God in school. I'll teach it to them at home. So you can't say certain things about God in public. We'll say what we need to say in church. And I get that. I mean, I do. But the reason it's such a big deal is that our national conscience is tied to the existence and presence of God. And so it has nothing to do with God's not getting enough face time. It has everything, listen to me, it has everything to do with what's right and what's wrong as a nation. Do you hear me? And I'm telling you, the further that we distance ourselves from the mention of God publicly, nationally, politically, the further away we get from being able to express gratitude for God and accountability to God. And here's what must be understood. Something else must take God's place in that role. It doesn't just disappear. Something has to inform our national conscience. What's it going to be? So behind the scenes, the debate that's going on right now that I wish would bubble to the top isn't about political systems. It's not about Democrat versus Republican. It's not about conservative versus liberal. The real debate is this: grateful and accountable versus ungrateful and unaccountable. On one side, you have the grateful and accountable who would say, you know what, it may be a little odd, it may sound a little funny, but I still give God the credit for the good things that have happened to me in my life and in this nation. And I still feel like we're personally and nationally accountable to God. That's kind of one side of the coin. Then on the other side is a group that says, no, I'm not grateful to God. If I'm going to be grateful to anybody, I should be grateful to myself. And honestly, I don't feel that I am accountable to God. Two different sides. And just take a second, let that sink in. Sometimes you'll hear the discussion about, our country just seems different. Something just isn't the same today as it was, 50 years ago, 100 years ago, or when it was first founded. Let me ask you this. Could it be that the real difference in our nation today is grateful and accountable to God versus ungrateful and unaccountable to God? See, one of the things that baffles the average American is politicians who have shameful things going on in their private lives but don't believe that those things affect their ability to lead me and my family and this nation. Right? Isn't that offensive to you? Now, listen, it's not just politicians. I'm offended by preachers who act like that. I'm offended by lawyers who act like that, doctors who act like that. But in a lot of ways, politicians, they make their living, they make their life out of saying, I am a representative of you. Right? I am worth representing you. So how can they do these shameful things and not think that it affects their ability to lead us? Well, it's very, very simple. Because in their heart of hearts, they don't feel accountable to God. Does that make sense? Here's my point. You take God out of the accountability system, and you end up with no accountability. Know how you know that? Just look at your own life. Look back in your life to the times where you felt like you had no accountability to God. Do you remember how you lived? I do. I remember it well. And then do you remember how things changed when you maybe came to that point in your life where you realized that your decisions had consequences? That it wasn't all about you. That one day you'll have to give an account to God. Do you remember how things changed in your life? See, the real issue is, are we going to be a nation with gratitude for God and accountability to God? Or are we going to be a nation where we don't express gratitude to God because it's not politically correct, and therefore we're not accountable to anyone? Is it going to be in God we trust? Or is it going to be in we trust? In me we trust? I believe that is the fundamental question. And once we resolve that, and if we were to have the courage to bring God back right into the middle of the conversation, I'm not talking about religion, I'm talking about God, then at least we've established a starting point for determining what ought and ought not to be in our nation. So I believe the question that we have to answer is this: what kind of nation do we want to be? Grateful and accountable, or ungrateful and unaccountable? What kind of president? What kind of legislators do we want to elect? Grateful and accountable, or ungrateful and unaccountable? What kind of Supreme Court justices do we want those politicians to appoint? Grateful and accountable, or ungrateful and unaccountable. And I personally think that we had better figure it out, because I'm not so sure that the current political and national environment that we're living in right now is sustainable. I'm not sure it can continue in the direction that it's going. So, maybe this Independence Day weekend, you'd take a break from the hot dogs and the fireworks and the patriotic marathons on TV to consider Deuteronomy 8, 10 through 16. When you have eaten your hot dogs and are satisfied, praise the Lord your God for the big backyard He has given you. Be careful that you do not forget the Lord your God, failing to observe His commands, His laws, and His decrees that tell you what's right and what's wrong. Otherwise, when you eat and are satisfied, when you build fine houses and settle down, and when your herds and flocks grow large, and your silver and gold increase, and all you have is multiplied, then your heart will become proud, and you will forget the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. Let's bow our heads together. With your heads bowed, let me just say this to you. I don't know that there's anything we can do this morning that's going to transform our nation. I don't think it works that way. But I do sort of believe this. I believe it starts individually. I believe it starts in our hearts. And so as we stand before God this morning, I want us to think about our part in this, in our own life, in our family, in our community, in our nation. Are we going to be accountable and appreciative? That means that we're going to let God determine what's right and what's wrong for us. Will we put our trust not in ourselves, not in our resources, not in our government? Will we put our trust in God? And over the next couple of days, as we get ready to celebrate Independence Day, maybe God would speak to an open heart about that. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the incredible blessings of most of us being born in the United States, of growing up here, in a lot of ways of being taught right from wrong that was based on your value system. And now, God, this country that we love, we see the drift away from you. And it scares us, and it worries us. But God, sometimes what we forget is that we are the ones who are responsible. We must be submitted to you. We must trust in you. And we must not be afraid to speak out for you, God. Not for religion. God, I couldn't care less about religion. I have no desire to. I don't want it in my own life. I sure don't want to impose it on anybody else. But God, at just the basic level of trusting you to inform our conscience, God, that's something we can do.